Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about my other passion, role-playing games, D&D in particular. So I've mentioned this several times before, and in fact today's video is sort of inspired by a suggestion from somebody that I do a video specifically about my interest in role-playing games and show off some of the role-playing figures that I've painted over the years. That's the whole purpose of today's video. So I'm going to keep this brief. I got into role-playing at a very early age. I've been in role-playing games over 40 years, possibly quite a bit more than that actually when I think about it. Group of friends at school, some of whom I still play with. We've kept in touch and we still game. Nowadays it's usually Zoom as our medium of getting together because we're scattered all across the globe. But we still play D&D, the latest version of it, and and occasionally I will still paint figures for it, even though we're obviously not using figures on the tabletop. And I've been a player and a dungeon master. I've written campaigns. I've used written campaigns, but I've also written my own campaigns. And at one point, I ran quite a long-running campaign in a world setting of my own creation. So something called the Isles of Ethos, basically a sort of dystopian future where most of the planet has been flooded, and this mountain range, this giant arcing continent-sized mountain range, has now become a series of islands, basically an arc of islands, the Isles of Ethos. Some of the larger islands are the inhabited ones, and different races inhabited different parts of the Isles. And although magic is still very much part of that world, magic users are very much distrusted because the cataclysm that brought about the flooding of the land was a magical cataclysm. So magic users have a hard time and often have to work in secrecy, which added a different element to the game that I was playing. It was a high magic game, but where you had to be very circumspect about how you used that magic. So it gave players quite an interest in conundrum, how to deal with things. I've always been a little bit of a showman, so when I ran the campaign, it was very much, at that time, it was very much about getting together physically and playing with miniatures on the table. And I did a lot of painting figures for that particular game, that series of games, even down to a whole section of city wall and the buildings associated with it for a particular moment during a siege. Essentially the game started off with basically a murder investigation, and the characters, the players, were brought together to solve a murder, and they had to explore this city that I'd written up. And during the process other things come into it. It turns out that it's more than just a murder. But like I say, I was trying to be very dramatic and theatrical about it, so I had a lot of painted figures that I painted specifically for that game to illustrate what I was describing to the players. And on a few occasions I went a little bit beyond that, possibly went a little bit too far. I mean, one story, I'm not even sure if I've told this story before to you, but I'll recount it for you now. There was a point in their investigation where they were getting close to their suspect, and in an attempt to either kill them or lose the track that was on the person who'd committed the crime, they released a cart down a steep hill towards the group of players who were tracking them, and this cart was full of fish, basically, and at some point the cart bounces, upends and explodes basically in a shower of wood and fish, at which point the little pot of fish heads that I'd been collecting over the previous few months, I tossed over the top of the DM screen, so they landed all over the table and all over their character sheets. Put it this way, it was probably a little bit too much, but you know what? They've never forgotten it, and every time we get together, somebody invariably mentions fish heads and they're laughing their arse off about it. So yes, I was completely out of order throwing all these rotten fish heads over the top of the table and to land in amongst their character sheets and their dice. But you know what? They're never going to forget that moment, and that was quite funny, especially for me, because I knew what was coming. I was sort of like, I was so looking forward to tossing these things over the top of the DM screen. But anyway, so I digress. So as well as using real props like fish heads, I painted a lot of figures. So the campaign went on. It took them out of the city and across the main island that they were on, and eventually they realised that they had to basically travel to the equivalent of hell to stop a plot that would basically unleash the contents of hell on the real world. And so they ended up, I literally sent my players to hell, and every one of them ended the campaign with various flaws as a result of the horrors of what they'd seen. But again, it made for a very interesting setting, with them trying to not only hide any magical abilities, but also try not to get caught out when they were in the various layers of hell, trying to solve this mystery that had gone from being a simple murder to a much bigger, grander plot. And as I say, all the way through, I had figures painted, so there was all sorts of beasties and all the classic D&D type monsters, but some others, some demons and things like that. Great fun, but of course all of this was happening while I was still a wargamer. We were, as a group, we were still playing things like Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and then moving on to science fiction, so epic 40k. So we were wargaming as well at the same time, but we've always, as a group, always played some form of role-playing games, and indeed that's how I learned to paint. My first models were painted for D&D, awful painted, using enamels and shiny varnish, that really get my hackles up when I think about it now. I wish I'd kept, I don't ever know what happened to the original figures that I painted. I wish I'd kept them. I didn't even get photographs of them. I mean, nowadays I wouldn't think, I would never dream of not photographing what I've painted, just in case something happens to it. But yeah, my first models were painted with enamels and then gloss varnished. But do you know what? I was really proud of them. I was surprised at how well they came out. I mean, not by my current standards, it has to be said. I learned a lot over the following years. I moved to acrylic paints, water-based paints, learned about shading and so on, and basically learned the art of painting miniatures, because we wanted miniatures down on the table for D&D. So if it wasn't for D&D, I wouldn't have got into painting miniatures, and as a group we wouldn't then have gone on to wargaming, and that ultimately led to historical wargaming some years later. For some of us, not everyone, the rest of the group, they still role play, but some of them don't play anything else. Some are more into ball games. I've still got my love of D&D, but also obviously branched into historical wargaming. I don't think I would play fantasy wargaming anymore, but I certainly do fantasy roleplay, and on those rare occasions that we can still get the group together physically, we will try and fit in an actual real game with real figures. Most of the time, as I say, we're now playing it by Zoom, from the various four corners of the earth where we all live. But when my friend comes over from Los Angeles, and my other mate comes down from Lincoln and various other locations that they all live and work, if we can get together, we will try and have a physical game, and that means models on the table, harking back to our roots, how we did, for some of us, how we started way back when we were still at school. And I'm never going to lose my love of that. And for if it wasn't for games like D&D, I probably wouldn't be a wargamer. I mean, I've said this before. A lot of people have got this almost stereotypical entry into wargaming. Having found a copy of Charles Grant or Featherstone or something like that. That wasn't my route into wargaming. I discovered those books and loved them later, but my route into wargaming was actually via role-playing games and painting miniatures for role-playing games, and that inevitably led to companies that were making both fantasy figures and historical figures, and and then the internet comes along, and lo and behold, the whole world opens up. So there you go, a little bit of a background about the role-playing games that I've played, and why I think, for me personally, it's an essential part of my story about why I'm a wargamer now. So as usual, I'm going to ask you, was your route into wargaming via something like D&D or another role-playing game, or indeed some other form of game that ultimately led to miniatures wargaming. You know, maybe you was a board game wargamer, or played something completely different. You know, did you have what I would call a non-traditional entry into wargaming? I'd love to hear, as always, your stories, you know, your background, how you got into it, and if you are indeed started out as a D&D player, do you still play? I know some of you do, you know, from the previous comments. So I'd love to hear, what is it you play now? Do you still play? Do you play D&D, or do you play another role-playing game? Do you still paint miniatures for it, or has it all gone online? So as always, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. So that's it for this week. A little bit of a ramble. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, subscribe and share. And of course, if you want to keep up to date with my weekly videos, please press the bell notification icon. So until next week, look after yourself, keep gaming, whether that's wargaming or role-playing, and of course, keep rolling high.